What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. All right, so for a little context, Leviticus has mostly been about different commands and laws that God is giving to the people. First, it started off with offerings, and then we took a little break from rules to talk about the ordination of the priests. And then very quickly thereafter, Aaron's sons messed up, did something they weren't supposed to do, and God killed them for it. So then it got even further in the past couple of chapters into, what is clean and unclean, what is pure and holy and righteous versus what is not, and kind of solidifying further that, okay, these are the expectations that I have of my people, especially priests who are going to represent me to my people. So, yeah, the past couple of chapters in particular have been emphasizing cleanliness and purity and those kinds of things. We might still be getting into things related to that. We'll just have to see what exactly the chapter holds. So, Leviticus chapter 13. And before I get into reading the chapter, actually, one last little note. I realized, as I was doing some things throughout this past week, I may have had Bible Gateway here on a different translation than I meant to for a few chapters of the Bible study. Not that that's the worst thing in the world. Just realized I had the idea of doing this the entire way through with the New Living Translation. And then I guess maybe for some research purposes in between some videos, I looked at a different version and then forgot to set it back. So, anyway. Okay, here we go. Leviticus 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "If anyone has a swelling or a rash or discolored skin that might develop into a serious skin disease, that person must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons. The priest will examine the affected area of the skin. If the hair in the affected area has turned white and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, it is a serious skin disease, and the priest who examines it must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean." See, there we are talking about, clean versus unclean again. Quick check of the footnotes. Traditionally rendered as leprosy, meaning the serious skin disease. The Hebrew word used throughout this passage is used to describe various skin diseases, and that was something that I kind of remember learning as I grew up and talked a little bit more about what was in the Bible and what the heck even leprosy was, because that's kind of an unfamiliar thing for most of us in this day and age. So, yeah, really leprosy was maybe not a catch-all, but definitely a broad term to refer to a variety of different types of possible skin diseases, as described in here. Affected area turning white, more than skin deep. Sorry, hair in the affected area turned white, more than skin deep. Yeah. Footnote there, instead of one of his sons, it could say one of his descendants, which makes sense for this to hold true in perpetuity. Later down the line, when Aaron and his actual sons are no longer alive, they can still, act upon this. Anyway, I will not be spending too long on comments for any one particular section because of how long this chapter is. So, if you have any thoughts along the way, feel free to leave a thought somewhere in the comments, chat, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, unless I read anything else, I will be moving along fairly quickly between these sections. So, verse 4. But if the affected area of the skin is only a white discoloration and does not appear to be more than skin deep, and if the hair on the spot has not turned white, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has not changed and the problem has not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 more days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has faded and has not spread, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. It was only a rash. The person's clothing must be washed, and the person will be ceremonially clean. But if the rash continues to spread after the person has been examined by the priest and has been pronounced clean, the infected person must return to be examined again. If the priest finds that the rash has spread, he must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean, for it is indeed a skin disease. Okay. So, more description on what is and is not considered a serious skin disease, some of the procedure that the priest would follow for determining that, and I would assume the whole, if it's still there and doesn't spread, it hasn't grown but it hasn't diminished kind of thing, I would assume if that continues for multiple weeks that they would still do the whole look at it and quarantine loop. But most rashes and things like that would probably start to fade after a couple of weeks. So that's probably why there's that particular timeline to it. So then at that point, the person's considered clean. They just need to wash their clothes and they're good. But then if it grows, it's obviously worse than just a simple rash or something like that. So then they're considered ceremonially unclean. Now, what exactly is meant by ceremonially unclean? I'm not 100% sure. I know that would have meant not being able to go into the tabernacle and things like that, but beyond that, I'm not as certain. Anyway. Okay, moving along. Verse 9. Anyone who develops a serious skin disease must go to the priest for an examination. If the priest finds a white swelling on the skin, and some hair on the spot has turned white, and there is an open sore in the affected area, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. In such cases, the person need not be quarantined, for it is obvious that the skin is defiled by the disease. So the quarantining is just to kind of wait and see what happens when, the extent of the skin condition is unsure. Yeah. Verse 12. Now suppose the disease has spread all over the person's skin, covering the body from head to foot. When the priest examines the infected person and finds that the disease covers the entire body, he will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. Since the skin has turned completely white, the person is clean. But if any open sores appear, the infected person will be pronounced ceremonially unclean. The priest must make this pronouncement as soon as he sees an open sore, since open sores indicate the presence of a skin disease. However, if the open sores heal and turn white like the rest of the skin, the person must return to the priest for another examination. If the affected areas have indeed turned white, the priest will then pronounce the person ceremonially clean by declaring, "You are clean." So, That's interesting and somewhat unexpected. Saying if the disease spreads all over, but like the only kind of disease I can think of that's a skin disease that would even maybe cover your entire body like that, especially, in a way that would turn your skin white, is, I forget what it's called, but it's the kind of skin condition like, I know there's a somewhat recent model that has it where her skin looks patchy, for lack of a better way to put it. Like some of it's darker, but some of it looks like white. So maybe that's the kind of skin disease in question when talking about this kind of situation. I'm not super knowledgeable of that condition to know if A, that's classified as a disease, and B, if it has a habit of spreading to the point of eventually covering all of your skin so that it's uniformly white. But maybe. Or something similar to that. Obviously, I think the point here is anything that's really infectious and possibly even contagious is a no-no. But stuff that, isn't causing any open sores, isn't doing any significant actual health damage to the skin, might kind of be okay. So, it would obviously look odd given the difference in tone, but if it's not doing anything really bad, like causing any sores or anything, then I guess it's considered fine, thus the priests can pronounce them clean. Okay. Enough of that, moving along. Verse 18. Yeah. If anyone has a boil on the skin that has started to heal, but a white swelling or a reddish white spot develops in its place, that person must go to the priest to be examined. If the priest examines it and finds it to be more than skin deep, and if the hair in the affected area has turned white, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. The boil has become a serious skin disease. But if the priest finds no white hair on the affected area, and the problem appears to be no more than skin deep and has faded, the priest must quarantine the person for 7 days. If during that time the affected area spreads on the skin, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean because it is a serious disease. But if the area grows no larger and does not spread, it is merely the scar from the boil, and the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. Okay, so scars are, possible reasons to consider this process, which, scars in and of themselves aren't infectious diseases or anything. So the whole skin disease phrase maybe isn't the most accurate way of describing it. Probably the reason leprosy was used in a lot of other translations. The boil in and of itself obviously is not a good thing, but not all boils are necessarily contagious or infectious. Well, infectious maybe, contagious not necessarily. But in any case, similar process for before. Right. I had a thought about the whole white hair thing. The reason you would look for white hair is probably because, that means the skin around there is probably kind of dying out or in some other way significantly affected. Anyway, okay. Quick sip of water. And then on to verse 24. If anyone has suffered a burn on the skin, and the burned area changes color, becoming either reddish white or shiny white, the priest must examine it. If he finds that the hair in the affected area has turned white, and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, skin disease has broken out in the burn. The priest must then pronounce the person ceremonially unclean, for it is clearly a serious skin disease. But if the priest finds no white hair on the affected area, and the problem appears to be no more than skin deep and has faded, the priest must quarantine the infected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must examine the person again. If the affected area is spread on the skin, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean, for it is clearly a serious skin disease. But if the affected area has not changed or spread on the skin and has faded, it is simply a swelling from the burn. The priest will then pronounce the person ceremonially clean, for it is only the scar from the burn. So, as you can see, again, process very similar for a lot of these different instances. And so far we've covered specifically boils, burns, just other possible rashes and things like that. So, yeah, clearly there's a variety of things being examined here. And, you know, given medical knowledge of the time, I guess this was just kind of a way to help figure out what was going on and just how serious it may or may not have been. Since, you know, they obviously didn't have all the modern tools that we have in this day and age to figure out, you know, what might be wrong with a person health-wise. Verse 29. If anyone, either a man or woman, has a sore on the head or chin, the priest must examine it. If he finds it is more than skin deep and has fine yellow hair on it, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. It is a scabby sore of the head or chin. If the priest examines the scabby sore and finds that it is only skin deep, but there is no black hair on it, he must quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must examine the sore again. If he finds that the scabby sore is not spread and there is no yellow hair on it, and it appears to be only skin deep, the person must shave off all hair except the hair on the affected area. Then the priest must quarantine the person for another 7 days. On the 7th day, he will examine the sore again. If it has not spread and appears to be no more than skin deep, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. The person's clothing must be washed, and the person will be ceremonially clean. But if the scabby sore begins to spread after the person is pronounced clean, the priest must do another examination. If he finds that the sore has spread, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The infected person is ceremonially unclean. But if the color of the scabby sore does not change and black hair has grown on it, it is healed. The priest will then pronounce the person ceremonially clean. Okay, so I'm taking a logical leap here in saying that black hair is mentioned pretty much because of the people in question, where they live, and their general, you know, biology, the lineage, their ancestry, and the physical traits that go along with that, black hair being an example. I mean, these are people living in Israel, or, well, not in Israel this time, but near there. So, you know, Middle East area, probably going to have a, like, tan complexion and most likely black hair. So it's a slightly more involved process for, you know, a sore or scab or whatever. And I think for this is probably the kind of thing you typically worry about if, like, something gets cut open or whatever, and, you know, it bleeds, but then, like, the bleeding stops, but, like, the skin gets infected through dirt or whatever else, and, like, starts spreading that way. That's probably the kind of infection they're looking for here. Or at least that's my best guess. In any case, the reason for the shaving of the hair, whether, you know, facial hair, if it's on the chin or whatever, or like head hair, if it's up there, is probably to help make it easier to see if and how far the infection, disease, whatever, would have spread on the person. Yeah, otherwise it's a fairly similar process. Just main difference being the whole shaving of the hair wherever the sore happens to be. Okay. I will move along to verse 38. Probably do all the rest of this for now. And then move on to the next section after some comments. But anyway. Okay. Verse 38. If anyone, either a man or woman, has shiny white patches on the skin, the priest must examine the affected area. If he finds that the shiny patches are only pale white, this is a harmless skin rash, and the person is ceremonially clean. If a man loses his hair and his head becomes bald, he is still ceremonially clean. And if he loses hair on his forehead, he simply has a bald forehead, he is still clean. However, if a reddish-white sore appears on the bald area, on top of his head or on his forehead, this is a skin disease. The priest must examine him, and if he finds swelling around the reddish-white sore anywhere on the man's head, and it looks like a skin disease, the man is indeed infected with a skin disease and is unclean. The priest must pronounce him ceremonially unclean because of the sore on his head. Those who suffer from a serious skin disease must tear their clothing and leave their hair uncombed. They must cover their mouth and call out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as the serious disease lasts, they will be ceremonially unclean. They must live in isolation in their place outside the camp. So, with that sentence, especially the part that's as long as the serious disease lasts, they will be ceremonially unclean. So, that does make assumptions / leave room open for the disease healing again and, you know, the person being considered clean again afterwards. But in order to help keep it from spreading to anyone else, they were supposed to go outside the camp while they had the skin disease. Yeah. Also, recognition that men just become bald sometimes. Occasionally there's a skin disease involved, but not always. So yeah. The last couple of verses there almost seem to be like, okay, after all this stuff that we've described, if any of this stuff happens, and it's determined there's a serious skin disease, here's what you do. Footnote here. So, rather than say, tear their clothing and leave their hair uncombed, it could read, tear their clothing and uncover their heads. Because, I mean, the whole uncovering their head would makes sense from a Jewish standpoint because, they typically wear the yarmulke. Pretty sure that's what that's called. And so as a sign to others of their uncleanness, that was to be taken off. Especially if it involved their head, that would make sense. Because then it would be more apparent what the skin issue was. Or that there was some sort of skin issue. So yeah, anyway. Now on to verse 47. Now suppose mildew contaminates some woolen or linen clothing, woolen or linen fabric, the hide of an animal, or anything made of leather. If the contaminated area in the clothing, the animal hide, the fabric, or the leather article has turned greenish or reddish, it is contaminated with mildew and must be shown to the priest. After examining the affected spot, the priest will put the article in quarantine for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must inspect it again. If the contaminated area has spread, the clothing or fabric or leather is clearly contaminated by a serious mildew and is ceremonially unclean. The priest must burn the item, the clothing, the woolen or linen fabric, or piece of leather, for it has been contaminated by a serious mildew. It must be completely destroyed by fire. So, we were talking about, people and their skin. Now we're getting into similar issues that would get on, surfaces. Especially clothing and fabrics in this case. Footnote here at mildew, also traditionally rendered leprosy. Hebrew term used throughout this passage is the same term used for the various skin diseases. So, yeah, leprosy was very much a broad term. And, trying to delineate between those, the authors or translators in the New Living Translation, at least, decided to opt for mildew as, okay, here's something that's similar, but, for not human skin. Or not skin at all, really, for, fabrics and clothing and things. So, kind of similar process for determining if it's clean or unclean. But if it's considered unclean, then, it's just burned. Because it's nope, this is no good. We don't want anybody coming into contact with this ever, so bye-bye it goes. Not really so moral to do that for people, which is why that's not an option for the people. So yeah, anyway. Moving along to verse 53, and then I'll probably just read through to the end of the chapter. But if the priest examines it and finds that the contaminated area has not spread in the clothing, the fabric, or the leather, the priest will order the object to be washed and then quarantined for 7 more days. Then the priest must examine the object again. If he finds that the contaminated area has not changed color after being washed, even if it did not spread, the object is defiled. It must be completely burned up, whether the contaminated spot is on the inside or outside. But if the priest examines it and finds that the contaminated area has faded after being washed, he must cut the spot from the clothing, the fabric, or the leather. If the spot later reappears on the clothing, fabric, or leather article, the mildew is clearly spreading, and the contaminated object must be burned up. But if the spot disappears from the clothing, fabric, or leather article after it has been washed, it must be washed again. Then it will be ceremonially clean. These are the instructions for dealing with mildew that contaminates woolen or linen clothing, or fabric, or anything made of leather. This is how the priest will determine whether these items are ceremonially clean or unclean. So, yeah, we covered the unclean part starting in verse 47. Part of the rest of that was like, well, okay, what if it looks like maybe it's clean? Or, they leave it to see what happens, come back and inspect it, and it's like, okay, this hasn't spread. But if it didn't change color from the discoloration that it already had, then it's like, okay, no, this is bad, away it goes. But then if it's like fading from that discoloration, then it's like, okay, we'll wash it, leave it for another week, and then if it seems to be good after that, wash it again to make sure that it's extra clean, and then we're good. So, yeah, whether clothing or skin, this chapter was pretty much all about, determining discolored spots on things and how to, figure out if it's, whether or not it's okay. Also, footnote here at contaminated spot just says the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. Again, you'd probably have to look at the original Hebrew to have an idea of what it's referring to there, but that's the whole, that's in reference to where it's saying it must be completely burned up, whether it's inside or outside of the clothing or fabric or whatever. Okay. So I guess that about wraps things up for Leviticus 13. Okay, so basically a lot of stuff about what was classically deemed leprosy, like spotty skin conditions or even like stuff on fabrics and things like that. But basically discolorations that could be like infectious or some sort of disease or something like that. And basically procedures for determining how bad it is, whether to deem the person or object unclean, and all kinds of stuff like that. Because again, the kind of the theme of the past few chapters has been all about like cleanliness and purity and things like that. So anyway, yeah, that does it for this one. So, as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Make sure to look down in the description for info on my social media pages and all that good stuff, and leave comments below that with any thoughts you have. So that's it. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next chapter. But until then, stay cool, people.